Welcome to the Midwest Marvel Podcast. On today's episode, I'm going to be giving my full breakdown and reaction to Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. I'm your host, Nick Adams, aka Midwest Marvel Guy, and I am so excited for this podcast episode today. My co-host Zeke Farnsworth unfortunately is unable to join me today. He came down with the flu, which is kind of odd because last week when I was doing the podcast for the Black Panther Wakanda Forever premiere, it turns out that I had COVID as I was doing that podcast and ended up with COVID throughout the next couple of days last week. And so now Zeke has the flu and he's completely incapacitated. He feels like absolute garbage. So he unfortunately cannot make it today, but the show goes on. I am so pumped to talk about this movie with you guys. Obviously, spoilers ahead. If you have not seen Black Panther Wakanda Forever, like this episode or subscribe to the podcast or bookmark it. Do whatever it is that you need to do to come back to this episode after you've seen the movie, because there will be no spoilers spared here. Everything's going to be talked about. I am going to ruin the entire movie if you have not seen it before. And so make sure that you are not listening to this unless you have seen the movie or if you're okay with having the entire thing spoiled, because we're going to go into all of it and it's so good. Before we get started, make sure you guys follow me on those social media platforms at TikTok, on YouTube, on Instagram, all of those. The handle is Midwest Marvel Guy. Make sure you guys follow me. I would truly appreciate it. Working really hard to building up a following on there. And I love and appreciate your guys' support each and every single week. So, Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. Guys, I'll be honest. I was as excited about this movie as I have been about any Marvel movie in the last year. Spider-Man No Way Home I was extremely excited for, and so that excitement level is probably about the same as what Wakanda Forever is. But Wakanda Forever just felt different because Black Panther is one of my top 5 favorite MCU movies, and then obviously with all the circumstances of the passing of Chadwick Boseman and just everything, all the build up to this movie, I was so incredibly hyped for it, and I got to tell you, I was not let down. I was not let down whatsoever, and I'm going to get into why that is and what my honest thoughts are about the movie. But first, just an instant reaction, okay? Let's just start off with that. Just an instant general reaction, and then dive into specifics throughout the course of the entire movie. Instant reaction, I feel like this movie was some of Marvel's best storytelling, character development, acting, all those things. Some of the best of all of those categories to date. And honestly, it may be the best. It might be the best acting in any MCU movie, period. It might be the best storytelling in any MCU movie, period. And it is definitely some of the best, if not the best, character development that the MCU has ever seen, period. I mean, Ryan Coogler and the entire crew, the cast, did such a fantastic job with this. And it's insane because they had the near impossible task in rewriting this movie without one of its most iconic main characters in the MCU or in Marvel history, period, in T'Challa, the Black Panther. And not only did they just pull it off, but they pulled it off beautifully. And that's a feat in and of itself, because let's be honest, this movie could have tanked. This movie could have been an absolute train wreck. And I don't think anybody would have blamed them. If this movie just turned out horrible, I don't think anyone would have given Marvel crap for it. They would have said, hey, you know what? Completely understandable given the circumstances. You guys tried your best. There's not much that could have been done. You guys did your thing. It's okay. We're going to give you a pass on this one. And it wasn't that. It was a masterpiece of a film. And in my opinion, obviously, movies are subjective. And so you may have felt differently about the movie than I did. But I thought it was a masterpiece of a film, especially given the circumstances that they had to endure when making this. And there were so many things about it that were so great. It's not a perfect movie, and there were definitely some things, and I'm still processing some of the things that I feel like maybe weren't perfect. Honestly, as a whole, the movie was so much to take in. So much to take in. It was 2 hours and 41 minutes, I think is what the runtime was. So I think second longest running MCU movie to date, I believe, is the actual number on that. And so it was long, but on top of that, there was so much packed in. Like it needed to be long with all the different things that they were trying to do. It wasn't just a whole bunch of filler time. The movie needed to have that length. And so it was just so much to take in. And I think especially on top of grieving for T'Challa slash Chadwick Boseman throughout the movie, and as an audience, just processing and really finally coming to just a conclusion in our grieving process for him, and having it happen during the course of the movie. Sometimes it was just hard to collect my thoughts in the movie because there is just so much that my brain was trying to process with all of that. And so this is one of those movies that I know without a shadow of a doubt I'm going to enjoy even more the second time around, and I'm hoping to see it for the second time this week. I'd honestly love to see it 3 or 4 times. I don't know if I'm going to actually get to that much just because of time constraints, but I definitely want to at least see it at least 3 times. 3 times I feel like would be the sweet spot, but I think 2 times I will absolutely just love it even more. And I loved it the first time around. It's not that I thought it was just okay the first time around, but that's how I typically am with movies anyway. A lot of times with movies, I will enjoy them even more the second time I see it, just because I'm able to just take everything in and I'm able to catch things I didn't catch the first time. And that's definitely going to happen with this movie because of how long it is, because of how much was packed in. There are definitely going to be things that I'm going to catch the second time around that I did not catch the first time, or just vaguely caught the first time around. And so I'm really excited to see this movie for the second time. As far as where I rank this among the MCU films, I'm not 100% sure. And again, that's a judgment that I have to make after I've already seen it once or already seen it twice. I rarely ever like to make a snap judgment on where I place a movie within the MCU, or just how I rank or rate a movie in general the first time I see it. If it's a good enough movie, I want to see it twice so I can really make a clear-cut judgment on it, and that's the case with Wakanda Forever. I will say this. Off of a first watch, I do think it's the best Phase 4 movie. I loved Spider-Man No Way Home, guys. I loved it. Thought it was a phenomenal movie. And I understand No Way Home is not a perfect film. It does have some ridiculously glaring plot holes, and there are some faults. And yes, the movie was carried a lot by nostalgia. But that being said, it is still a phenomenal movie and an absolutely blast of a time. Even watching it at home, still a phenomenal time. And the whole second half of that movie is just incredible. And so I don't understand this trend now to hate on Spider-Man No Way Home. I understand that we can be honest about the fact that it does have some glaring weaknesses and issues with the movie. But that being said, the strengths of the movie are so dang strong that I can overlook the weaknesses, because the whole second act of that film is just insanely good. And the inclusion of Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire, it wasn't just fan service. They played such an integral part to the movie and to Tom Holland's Spider-Man's story, and it just worked perfectly. So I don't understand the hate for No Way Home. No Way Home is a fantastic movie, and it's a top 10 MCU movie for me. I'd always gone back and forth about whether I thought Shang-Chi or No Way Home was the best Phase 4 movie, and at this point now, I feel like Wakanda Forever jumps both of them. As a film, the way it's constructed, like I said before, with the acting, with the storytelling, the character development, it tops all of those things. Now, Spider-Man No Way Home, probably some better action, and just better theater moments in general. One thing I will say, again, if somehow you're watching this and you haven't seen the movie, what are you doing here? But I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're listening. But also, what are you doing here? But for those of you guys that have seen the movie, I don't know about your theaters, but my theater was packed. We had a massive theater. It was packed. But the thing about this movie, and I expected it to be this way, the thing about this movie is that it was not a film where the audience is just going nuts at all these different moments throughout the course of the movie, right? It wasn't like Avengers Endgame. It wasn't like Spider-Man No Way Home, in the sense that every 10, 15 minutes when something cool happened, the audience just went absolutely nuts, and there was always audible laughter in the theater and audible reactions. That wasn't the case. There were very few instances in this movie, very few. I'm talking, I can easily count it on one hand, where there was an audible reaction from the audience in the theater. And I don't think it's because my theater was lame. I've actually heard that this was the case for a lot of people's theaters. It's just because that's what the tone of the movie is. This is a very heavy movie. This is an extremely heavy movie, and rightfully so. It makes perfect sense because it deals so heavily with the topics of grief and trauma and figuring out how to work through those things in the midst of all the stuff that's actually happening in the movie. And so this wasn't a movie where it was set up to have all these really funny one-liners that was just going to get the audience in stitches and all these different things. And so the vibe of the theater was just different. That doesn't mean it wasn't a fantastic movie, because there are so many really good movies that just don't generate those kinds of reactions because they're not built for that. And honestly, I appreciated that. One thing I will say about No Way Home that does kind of rub me the wrong way, and I get it, like, I understand why they did it this way, but there are clear moments in No Way Home where there are pauses because they know the audience is going to react, and because they knew in theaters people were going to lose their minds. Like when Andrew Garfield comes through the portal for the first time and he takes off his mask, he has that moment where he just kind of sits there like, ta-da, and he doesn't say anything for a good couple of seconds. And in the theater, you didn't notice it because everyone was losing their freaking minds. But when you watch it in a smaller theater where there aren't that many people, and so there's not really a reaction, or you watch it at home, it's a very awkward moment. Yes, it's cool, but it's also very awkward because it is blatantly obvious that that moment was generated to do just that, and that they had that pause for that exact reason. And I appreciate that Wakanda Forever wasn't going for any of that. Like, they just wanted to make a good film, and they did. It was an incredible film. I do think it was the best Phase 4 movie. I'll make that final judgment when I end up seeing it a second time, but I really think that that's where my heart's going to end up lying. It was just incredible. There was so much good things, and the more that I've let it sit and fester and allowed myself to just dwell on the movie, the more I'm loving it. Just as I'm reliving some of the parts that I can remember in the film, it was awesome. Okay, let's talk about the way that this movie honored Chadwick Boseman, aka T'Challa, because that was one of the things that I heard going into this movie, that the movie did such a great job paying tribute to him. And after watching it, I completely 100% agree. It was just so beautiful the way that they paid tribute to him. And I know from hearing a lot of people talk about it that there wasn't a dry eye in almost any theater. Surprisingly, I shocked myself. I did not cry once during this movie, and I don't know how. Honestly, I was on the tail end of recovering from COVID, and so I think I still had that COVID brain. Like, I was definitely exhausted that night for multiple reasons. COVID, obviously, but also the night before, I was so excited about going to see the movie. I had a hard time sleeping because I'm like a little kid when it comes to that type of thing. And so I don't know. I just think I was out of it. And I really do think the second time I see this, I'll end up probably bawling my eyes out, because I do that in movies. If there are powerful emotional moments, I have no issue shedding some tears during a movie. And I thought it was going to happen during this one, and it didn't. But I know a lot of people who did, and rightfully so, because there are so many moments in this movie that are worthy of that. And they did such a phenomenal job honoring Chadwick. I love the decision to start the movie with the whole scene where Shuri is figuring out how to try to save her brother. Like, we're literally thrust into the middle of a moment where T'Challa is on his deathbed and they're trying to figure out how to save him. And I just thought that was such a surreal, somber, and just grounded way to start the film and really just hit you with emotion. I've seen people say that they felt like it should have started with the funeral. And honestly, it would have been a good beginning to the movie too. But I love the way that they started with that scene, because I felt like it just really hit hard watching that happen. And most importantly, I think that scene was very important for Shuri's character development, because we got to see her wrestle with her quote unquote failure. It's not her fault that her brother died, but she obviously puts it on herself throughout the course of the movie. And then on top of that, she also wrestles with questioning the existence of the ancestral plane and Boston, all those things, because she prayed that that T'Challa would get healed, and he isn't. And so that's a common theme for her throughout the course of the movie as well. So that's the biggest thing. It was key to her character development and her arc throughout the film. But also, I just think it was a fantastic way to start it. But the funeral scene was beautiful. I love that it had that dichotomy of being a celebration, because it was a celebration, and it should be a celebration of what Chadwick and T'Challa have meant to everybody, fans, his family, just the world. Such a beautiful human being, such a beautiful soul, and deserves to be celebrated and remembered in such a beautiful way like that. But at the same time, in that scene, you could see the grief and the mourning from characters like Ramonda and Shuri and Okoye and all those people who were closest to him, because that's a real thing too. Even though we celebrate it, that doesn't mean there's not mourning, and that doesn't mean there's not sadness. And I thought it did such a good job of displaying that dichotomy, because that's a real thing in real life. You want to celebrate people, but you also can't help but mourn, because that's just a part of being a human being. And it was a beautiful scene. It was a beautiful tribute. I'm so glad that they did that, because we needed that. All of us needed that, and it was great. One question that I had going into the movie, we had talked about this last week on the podcast, was how were they going to have T'Challa pass in the film? What was going to be the cause of his death? And we speculated. I speculated that I thought it could be an illness, that they could just go the route of what he ended up battling in real life, which was an illness. And obviously that ended up being the case. And I really do like that that's what they chose. Now, it is worth noting that this was a decision that wasn't made lightly. Ryan Coogler talked with Chadwick Boseman's family prior to the film and prior to making the decision of how they were going to portray T'Challa's passing, and he had their blessing to do it this way, because obviously this way of having him pass was so much more grounded in reality, because that's what actually happened in real life. And even the way that it ended up happening in the film was so mirrored to what had happened in real life, because in the film, we find out that T'Challa had kept it a secret from everybody, just like Chadwick Boseman did in real life. But he prepared the ones who were closest to him for his death, again, just like he did in real life. I think the decision to have his death be due to an illness in the film, that line between reality and fiction basically didn't exist. I think almost everything that we saw in the movie in terms of grief from the characters wasn't acting. I really truly think that by and large, that was all just us witnessing the cast mourning the loss of their friend Chadwick on screen. We just happened to see it with millions and millions of other people, but I think those were real tears. I don't think those were acted tears. I think they were real. And I think that's part of what makes this movie so beautiful, is we all get to go through that grieving and mourning process for Chadwick Boseman and T'Challa together. And I just love that. One thing about this too, this doesn't really have to do with honoring Chadwick Boseman, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Killmonger here in a little bit, but this is related to his death in the movie. I also love that right away, right from the get-go, we see the effects of what Killmonger did in the original Black Panther movie by burning the heart-shaped herb. They could have easily wrote the heart-shaped herb back in some way, shape, or form, as if it was just always growing somewhere else or something, right? They didn't have to stick with that. They didn't have to make it so the heart-shaped herb just didn't exist anymore. People write crazy things in comic book movies all the time. They could have totally gotten away with just, oh, hey, we happen to be discovering in the woods, and we found out that the heart-shaped herb, it actually grows here too. And so now we have a whole new plethora of heart-shaped herbs. And they instead chose for Killmonger's decision to destroy the heart-shaped herb to reverberate throughout the entire nation of Wakanda. And they were without that. Therefore, they were without a true Black Panther in the sense that it was a Black Panther who was empowered by the heart-shaped herb, by Bast. And they also then didn't have the healing effects of the heart-shaped herb that Chadwick Boseman, the Black Panther, would have had it existed. And so, and they don't explain this, because he obviously did take the heart-shaped herb at the end of Black Panther when they find him in Jabari land. He takes the heart-shaped herb again. But my guess is that because of the blip, because of the snap, something happened with the effects wore off or something, or we're never quite really met with an explanation of how the heart-shaped herb works exactly. My imagination is that you have to take it again every so often for the effects to last. I don't think it's just a one and done thing. I think you take it, and then maybe like every year you have to take it again. And since they didn't have that, the effects wore off, and we see that. I mean, ultimately, like, Killmonger's impact is more than just changing the thought process of Wakanda, because he did that as well, but he also horribly damaged their infrastructure by removing the heart-shaped herb. And I just thought that was good, because a lot of times movies and universes will kind of just gloss over some of that stuff, and they won't make the effects of something that was damaging super long lasting. But that actually was the case here, and I don't know. I just thought that was a good decision. Let's talk about the score and the soundtrack, because that was one of my favorite things in this movie, bar none. The score and the soundtrack were absolutely phenomenal. There are very few movies that I've seen in my life where the score and the soundtrack help to tell the story as much as the score and soundtrack in this film did. And it just accentuated every single scene where there was a score and a soundtrack, no matter how subtle it was. I mean, it just added so much to it. And it's not even a surprise, because Ludwig Göransson, who is the composer who also did the score for the first Black Panther movie, is phenomenal. I mean, this guy does not miss when it comes to film scores. He is an absolute genius in every sense of the word. And when you look at his body of work, it speaks for itself. He won an Oscar for his score in Black Panther, the original movie, and rightfully so. That was the best score in the MCU to date. And I'd be shocked if Wakanda Forever doesn't also win an Oscar. I'm going back and forth in my head, but I feel like this movie had an even better score and soundtrack than the last one did, which is insane to say when the last one won an Oscar, but this one was just so good. And I think the emotion of the movie had something to do with that too, because the music just adds to the emotion of it. But it was phenomenal. But when you look at Ludwig Göransson's resume, this dude has Black Panther, he has Wakanda Forever, he has The Mandalorian, just an iconic score. The Book of Boba Fett, which, say what you will about the Book of Boba Fett, the show was okay, could have been a lot better, but the score slapped. That score hit, man. He's also done the Creed movies too, which have phenomenal scores. So, and then the soundtrack, which also does include Ludwig Göransson. He had a big hand in the soundtrack itself, but includes artists like Shuri, why did I say Shuri? Like Rihanna and Stormzy. I think, if I'm getting that right, British rapper, amazing artist, and so many others. It was just great, and I've been listening to that soundtrack and score on repeat ever since I watched the movie. I mean, it lives rent free in my head, and every time I hear some of those songs, I'm just instantly taken back to the worlds of Wakanda and Talokan. It makes me feel like I'm reliving the movie all over again, and I instantly associate them with the moments that they're tied to in the movie. And that's when you know a score does something powerful, right? When you can hear a song and associate it right away with something that you've seen at the same time that song played the first time you heard it, that's when you know it's doing its job. Like it's just powerful. Speaking of the world of Talokan, we have to talk about Namor, or Namor, however you want to pronounce it. What a powerhouse. What a phenomenal character. What an amazing antagonist. Easily one of the best antagonists in the MCU, in my opinion. I thought he was so well done. For those of you who aren't familiar, Namor is the longest running Marvel Comics character. So he is an icon in the world of Marvel. And the only reason he hadn't been in an MCU film up to this point yet is because his movie rights were owned, I think, by Universal for a really long time, oddly enough. And I don't think they did anything with it, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, so he hasn't had an appearance in the MCU until now. But man, was it worth the wait. What a fantastic introduction to his character. And the thing I love the most about it, if you guys have listened to this podcast for long enough, you know how I feel about villains. I love a sympathetic villain, and he was a sympathetic villain. And honestly, he might be the most sympathetic villain that we've ever had in the MCU. And I'd really have to sit down and think about whether or not somebody else might fit that bill a little bit better. But just on the surface and after a first watch, he really might be the most sympathetic villain in the MCU. And really, it's hard to even call him a villain in this film. Obviously, he was the antagonist, right? Like, he's the one who is opposing the main characters that we were watching in Shuri and Ramonda and Nakia and all of Wakanda. He was the main opposition, right? He was the force that was coming against him. But he was not the villain. The villain were the governments of the world, the U.S. government and any other governments that were trying to steal vibranium, not just from Wakanda, but from what we found out was Talokan in the ocean, and taking things that don't belong to them. They're the true villains, and we're going to get to that in a little bit because there's definitely a deeper message and something that this movie is setting up for down the road that I think is going to just be phenomenal. But Namor is such a sympathetic villain, and truly, I think that if you flip this movie around and we saw a majority of this movie from the perspective of Talokan and Namor, I'm going to pronounce his name a different way almost every time as I'm doing this because I said it both ways in the movie. He pronounces it Namor, obviously, but people also pronounce it Namor, and I'm just going to go with whatever feels right in the moment. But if we were seeing this from the viewpoint of Talokan and Namor, you would think he was right. You would 100% side with him and think that he was right, because when you see this man's backstory, even though we saw just a snippet of it, we didn't really get in depth. I think we will eventually, but when you saw his backstory, this man has every reason to hate the surface world. Every reason. And this is online in the comics as well, because in the comics, Namor hates the surface world. I mean, he just has a seething hatred and passion against the surface world. And in the movie, we see that he's seen what the surface world does to his people and how savage the surface world is in general. And honestly, I'd hate us too, to be honest. I kind of do a lot of times. And so I can't even blame the man. Like, when I saw him and his hatred for the surface world, I'm like, yeah, I get it. I'm right there with you, dude. And so when you think about it, when a situation arises in the film where his entire nation, which he has fought so hard to keep a secret and to keep private, when something happens that could expose his nation of Talokan, he wants to eliminate the problem at the source, which is Riri Williams. And to be honest, I can't blame him. Now, he doesn't know that Riri Williams didn't actually seek out the vibranium. She just created the machine, and then it was stolen from her. Like, the government used it in that way without her permission, which is a whole different thing. But Namor doesn't know that. He just knows that a scientist built a machine to detect vibranium, and that machine is being used to find vibranium that his nation has, and his nation's about to be exposed because of it. And I just truly think that he's right in almost every single way. Like, you can't blame the guy for wanting to eliminate Riri Williams and keep his nation a secret, because he's fought so hard to do that already. You can't blame him for wanting to just be a great leader for his people and protect his people, and also hating the surface world. It just makes perfect sense. So I loved his character. I loved how sympathetic they made him. And this dude was an absolute force, like an absolute unit throughout this entire movie. I mean, you think about this. He killed the Queen of Wakanda, which was shocking to me. I did not expect that to happen. I know some people did. I wasn't one of them. I didn't think she would die. Killed the Queen of Wakanda, floods the entire city of downtown Wakanda and evacuates it. The dude is single-handedly flying around destroying Wakandan airships. I mean, he was an absolute menace the entire time. I can't wait to see more of him in the MCU. And the thing I think I'm going to love the most about him is that it seems that he's always going to ride that line of hero and villain and always live in that gray area, which is how he is in the comics. So it only makes perfect sense. But I just feel like that makes his character so compelling, and I love that. And to be honest, we don't really have any characters like that in the MCU, do we? At one point, we had Loki, right? And we still have Loki. Loki's obviously still a character in the MCU, but Loki's not somebody that I would consider, at least not after his series. Maybe it's going to change in Loki season 2, but in Loki season 1, Loki definitely made that transition from villain and anti-hero to pretty much full-on hero. He's a good guy now. Like that. Like there's no going back in my mind. I feel like he's there. Like he has shifted. He has changed sides completely, and I don't think it's any debate over kind of where he sits and where his morals lie. I think Loki is a good guy now, but there was a time when Loki did live in that gray area all the time, and you never quite knew, was Loki a villain or was Loki a hero? Like, which version of him were we going to get in every project that we saw him in? I think that's how Namor is going to be. I think Namor is always going to be riding that line of, okay, is this villain Namor or is this hero Namor? And honestly, I think it's always going to come down to whether or not he feels like him and his people are threatened. If him being a villain is in the best action or is in the best interest of the people of Talokan, then he's going to be a villain. If him being a hero is in the best interest of the people of Talokan, he's going to be a hero, because that's just the way his character is. That's the way it is in the comics, and clearly that's the way he is in the movies. And they set him up to be this fantastic leader, and he is so fiercely loyal to his people. And so I believe that whatever kind of keeps him tiptoeing that line, that's going to be it. It's going to be, how does it affect the people of Talokan? And that's going to basically influence his decision making moving forward. Such a well done character. Tenoch Huerta, fantastic performance. Relative newcomer, just the acting in general, not super well known prior to this movie, and he absolutely knocked it out of the park. He was menacing. And he did so well that balance of seemingly being good, because like at his core, he's good. He's not an evil person. Like Killmonger was different. Killmonger in Black Panther 1 was, like, at his core was kind of an evil dude. And granted, a lot of that had been influenced by the things that had happened to him throughout the course of his life. But I mean, he had very evil intentions. Namor, not quite like that. Namor, at his core, good person, just wanting to lead fiercely for his people. Everything he did is for the people of Talokan. Tenoch Huerta, at times he was so calming. Like at the beginning of the movie, I saw this dude and I'm like, man, like, this guy's the villain? He just seems so nice. Seems so kind. And then he had moments, though, where he would say something or just kind of flip that switch, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, this guy's kind of intimidating. Like, this guy's a menace. And just such a phenomenal acting job by Tenoch Huerta. And so excited to see more of Namor in the MCU. Keeping in theme with Namor, I loved Talokan. I thought the city, the nation of Talokan was just beautiful. Visually, it was so stunning. I love the way that they portrayed it. Underwater civilizations are always tricky and difficult to figure out how to portray in movies, and I thought they did a fantastic job. One thing I will say is I would have liked to have seen more of Talokan, but at the same time, I understand why we didn't, because at the end of the day, it's not their movie. Yes, they had a big part in it, but this was about Wakanda. The name of the movie is literally Wakanda Forever, and so I feel like we got to see just enough to keep us informed, but also keep us wanting way more, which I think we're going to get. This clearly is not the last time we are seeing Talokan in the MCU. They're obviously setting up for way more, and so we're going to get to see more. This movie just was not the time or place to do that, but I loved what we saw, and it has me extremely excited for what comes next. Keeping on that subject, the characters of Atuma and Namora. So Namora was the kind of the main lead female for Talokan, and Atuma was the guy that had, like, the hammerhead shark helmet, like the hammerhead shark bone helmet. He's the one that was often fighting. I believe it was I think Okoye was the one that kept squaring off with him and squared off with him toward the end of the movie. I do wish, one critique that I do have in the movie is I do wish we could have gotten to know them a little bit more. And again, similar to just the nation of Talokan in general, I understand that it wasn't their movie. And so I know we're going to get to know them more eventually, but I do think it would have helped to just have them involved a little bit more, to hear from them a little bit more, to get to know their characters a little bit more. I think it would have given us an even bigger attachment to the people of Talokan. Unfortunately, all we really knew about Talokan was just Namor. We didn't really know anything of the people. We didn't have any real emotional attachment to any of the other people. I think it would have been great to get to know a couple more of those characters, just like we know some of the side characters in Wakanda. But I think we're getting a lot more. Atuma, I talked about this last week on the podcast. Atuma is a character in the comics who actually is more of a foe of Namor than an ally. In the comics, he actually tries to overthrow Namor and take over the throne because he doesn't believe, since Namor is a mutant, he's not full. In the comics, it's Atlantean. He's not full Atlantean in the comics. Therefore, Atuma doesn't believe he should be the one sitting on the throne. Atuma thinks it should be him. And so he ends up trying to overthrow Namor, and he gets banished and exiled from Atlantis. And honestly, I would be surprised if we didn't get a storyline of some sort similar to that at some point in the MCU. I really do think Atuma will try to overthrow Namor and take over the throne. So excited to see that. I do love the way that the Talokan warriors were introduced in this film. It was almost eerie the way that they were introduced, because we got to see them as like sirens, basically, which I thought was cool. That we get to find out that the whole legend and the myth of the sirens and the siren song of people out in the seas, and hearing the song that just like puts them in a trance. Turns out it's been the people of Talokan all throughout history that have been mistaken as sirens. And they sing that song to the people who are trying to drill for the vibranium in the ocean, and like literally just have people plunging off of the boat to their death. And the song itself was so just creepy and eerie, and it was perfect. And I love how covert they always were. They always were just like barely popping up out of the water, and you barely ever saw them, and you never knew when they were going to show up, and all of a sudden they were just there. And I thought it was so brilliantly done. And again, I cannot wait to see more of the people of Talokan, and especially Namor. So there's one character that I've actually seen a lot of controversy around with this movie, and I feel like this has probably been the biggest point of contention for most people. I've seen a lot of people say that this is the thing that they did not like about the movie and felt that the movie should have done differently, and that was the character of Riri Williams and her inclusion in the movie in general. I've seen a lot of people who felt like she shouldn't have been in the movie at all and didn't like that she was in it. They felt like she took away from the story. They felt like her inclusion was just completely unnecessary, and all it did was set up for future MCU projects, which it does set up for a future MCU project. We know that Ironheart is coming out. That's a show on Disney Plus, and I believe it comes out sometime in 2023. So yes, it's true that it does set that up. People aren't wrong in that, but I don't think it's accurate to say that that's the only reason she was in this film. And I think I'm in a minority when I say I actually really enjoyed her character. I didn't feel like she detracted from the story. I was worried going into it that her character would detract from the story, and I thought that she would just be a huge distraction and something that was really unnecessary. But to me, it didn't end up being that way. It ended up playing out the exact opposite, in my opinion. I think she was very integral to the story. And if you listened to the podcast last week, Zeke, my co-host, he actually called it to perfection. He said he theorized that Riri Williams was going to be the reason that Wakanda and Talokan ended up going to war. That she was going to do something that was going to piss off the people of Talokan, and as a result, they were going to try to kill her or do something, and Wakanda was going to step in to protect her. And that's exactly what happened. I don't know if this dude like had some intel prior to the movie coming out, but he called that to a T, because that is exactly what happened. And I honestly thought that was so well written. I didn't feel like that was a forced narrative whatsoever. I thought that made a whole lot of sense, and it just kept with the whole theme of the movie, that and the theme of just Wakanda in general, right? Wakanda's entire thing is that since their inception, Wakanda has always been secretive. They've always been private. They've always kept to themselves. And that was the thing, obviously, that T'Challa wrestled with in the first movie and that Killmonger was trying to push for, was that Killmonger had been abandoned by his nation and they could have helped him and they chose not to. And Killmonger saw people all over the world who looked like him, who weren't helped and were just helpless. And Wakanda obviously had the tools to liberate them and to come alongside them and help them live better lives. And Wakanda refused to do that. And he was able to, in a weird way, get Wakanda to see, get T'Challa to see that in a lot of ways he was right. Now he went about it the wrong way, but his ideology was right of wanting Wakanda to open up to the world and help the world. And obviously this was something that Nakia in the first movie was really hard on T'Challa about, and she's always felt like that from the get-go, from the first moment that we meet her. That is her thing. She wants Wakanda to help out the rest of the world. But Wakanda's always been so hesitant because, and you can't blame him, right? You can't blame him. Obviously, you see why Killmonger and Nakia are right. You see why they're right. But at the same time, you also see why the former leaders of Wakanda were right in wanting to stay a secret. And you see that in this movie. Like, this movie is the, like, example, exhibit A. This movie is exhibit A as to why Wakanda should have never opened up. Now, I'm still of the belief that they should have, but to anybody who wants to make the argument that they didn't need to or shouldn't have, this movie is the argument as to why. Because exactly what Wakanda thought was going to happen ended up happening. The rest of the world saw the value of vibranium and decided to come after it, especially when they see that Wakanda is weak. Wakanda's without their leader. They have nobody to protect them. Now's the time to strike if we want to get a hold of vibranium. That's been such a big theme for Wakanda, is just being secretive and being private and keeping to themselves. And I honestly forget where I was going with some of this because I know I was talking about Riri Williams. Her inclusion in this movie is that she, first of all, is a genius and built this device that is able to detect vibranium, and the government took this device and used it without her consent and in a way that she didn't realize it was being used, right? Maybe she knew the government was going to take it. She didn't know what it was going to be used for. I don't know. We don't get that much info, but my assumption is that she had no idea. And they basically exploit her, just like the government wants to do with Wakanda and with vibranium. They want to take vibranium and they want to use it and exploit it for their own purposes. And we even hear Valentina Allegra de Fontaine admit to Everett Ross that, yes, I think about what we would do with Wakanda all the time. And she doesn't say that with like a high level of morality in her voice. She says that with some deceitfulness, conniving. I don't know what the word is there, but she does not have the best of intentions. And you can tell when she's talking about the ways that she's dreamed of the U.S. being able to use vibranium. Like, clearly they just want to do it to flex their muscle, to show their power, to strong arm other nations into doing what it is that they want to do. And honestly, it's 1,000% something that the U.S. would do if vibranium was real and we got it. Like, this is what we would do. I don't blame Wakanda for not wanting to give anybody else vibranium because nobody else deserves it. And Wakanda has been kind of that all-knowing, like, hey, I'm not saying we're better than you guys, but we're better than you guys. We understand how to use this and what it could do to the rest of the world, and this is why we don't want you to get it. I just feel like Riri Williams fit that entire narrative. Like, she fit everything because she's experiencing the same thing that Wakanda is experiencing, which is she's being exploited for personal gain of others. And I felt like she fit right in with the people of Wakanda. She fit right in with somebody like Shuri. She's basically a carbon copy of Shuri. She's just incredibly powerful black woman genius. Like, that's what she is. Scientist. So smart, so intelligent. And I thought the chemistry between her and Shuri was phenomenal. I really liked her inclusion in the movie. If I could give a criticism about Riri Williams, my criticism would actually be that I felt like she was involved less as the movie went on when she should have been involved more. I think if you're going to have her in the movie, which I liked her inclusion in it, I think you need to have her more. Sometimes it just kind of felt like she was just there toward the end when I feel like she should have been involved more than she was. And I know other people may disagree with that. Some people might think, oh, well, I actually like that she was involved less. I wish they would have just taken her out completely. And I'm the different way. I feel like she should have been involved more. But that being said, I thought she fit perfectly. And I feel like she sets up for what's going to happen with Wakanda and the rest of the world in the future. That's what I see it as. I see it not as just setting up her project, which, yes, it kind of does in the sense that it introduces us to her character, but it sets up what's going to happen with Wakanda in what I will assume is Black Panther 3 or the Wakanda series coming out on Disney+, which I'm not 100% sure when that is. But what was revealed to us is that, again, like I said, with Valentina Allegra de Fontaine and Everett Ross, we find out that, yes, the U.S. is 100% planning on coming for Wakanda. Like, they want the vibranium more than anything. That is, like, priority number one for them. And we know that at the end of the movie, Talokan and Wakanda, they basically become allies, in a sense. They just agree to disagree. You know what? Let's just leave it at what it was and move on, and we can be of more help to each other than we can be of harm. So let's just join forces when we feel that it's necessary. And I really feel like we're going to see a Wakanda Talokan team up to basically protect their privacy and their resources from the rest of the world, mainly the U.S. And I almost wonder if that's not going to be a storyline of the Thunderbolts. And if not the Thunderbolts, then maybe Black Panther 3 or the Wakanda series. I'm not 100% sure, but I would be shocked if that does not end up being a storyline at some point, because it just seems like they are setting up for that. And it makes sense. That's kind of what the movies have been building toward for a long time. And so that makes me excited because I think there's so much potential in that storyline. First, it's been Wakanda fighting with itself, right? You had Killmonger comes into Wakanda, and Wakanda is at odds with how they should open themselves up to the rest of the world. That was Black Panther 1. Black Panther 2, it's Wakanda fighting against Talokan and Namor and all the things that came with that. Black Panther 3, I think the scope becomes even larger. Now it's Wakanda versus the world. Like a World War Wakanda movie. That would be so sick. And I'm 100% here for it. And yeah, so those are my thoughts on Riri Williams. I think it made 100% perfect sense why she was involved. I liked her character. My only complaint is that, honestly, I think we should have gotten a little bit more, but I think she fit the movie perfectly. If you disagree, that's totally okay. But to me, it made sense. I got it from the get-go. Okay, speaking of Valentina Allegra de Fontaine and Everett Ross, they were married? Was I the only one that was just shook when I heard that? I cannot believe that. They seem like such polar opposites to me. I cannot believe that they were married. I'm so curious to see where they go with this storyline in the future. But aside from that, we find out that Allegra de Fontaine is the director of the CIA, which is not what maybe I was just in the dark on this, but I didn't realize that she was a director of the CIA. I feel like this is the first time we're finding that out. I think that's big news because clearly she doesn't have the best of intentions. She doesn't have the best morals. And now she is obviously the head of one of the largest organizations in the world. And that can't mean good things. I don't know. I just feel like there's definitely something going on there. We know that she's going to be a big part of the Thunderbolts. I think she's going to be a big part of Captain America, New World Order as well. My question, though, is if Allegra de Fontaine is the director of the CIA, who's the president of the United States? Because she refers to the president a couple times. Here's my thought. My thinking is that Thunderbolt Ross is president. I think Thunderbolt Ross is going to be president of the United States if he's not already, and that's what we're going to see Harrison Ford as in that role. It just seems to make sense to me because whoever the president is, clearly she has some very close ties to, and she kind of just alludes to that in that movie, and it just makes sense to me that Thunderbolt Ross would be the president of the United States. Again, similar to Riri Williams, Dave Fontaine and Everett Ross are two other big points of contention for Wakanda Forever as far as things that people didn't like. For the same reason of Riri Williams, they felt like every time that it focused on Allegra de Fontaine and Everett Ross, that it detracted from the storyline. It just felt so out of place. It wasn't needed. and, so on and so forth. And once again, I disagree. For a lot of the same reasons that I mentioned with Riri Williams, I feel like Allegra De Fontaine and Everett Ross fit the story perfectly. Yes, it was a different set, different setting, different vibe. I get that. But I do think it was very important to the story and what's going to be happening with Wakanda and the rest of the world in the future. I think it's really setting up for the next installments of Black Panther and Wakanda in the MCU. So I do think this was very important because we know that the MCU is it's a massive universe. And yes, this was a standalone superhero movie, but it is still building toward other things. And so I feel like it's important that it sets up for whatever happens next to Wakanda and with the rest of the world. And I feel like their storyline did just that. So again, I like their involvement. I also didn't feel like any of their scenes were very long. I think it would have been different if their scenes were very drawn out and just took up a whole lot of time. Maybe I'll notice something differently on second watch, but on first watch, I didn't feel like that was the case. I didn't feel like their scenes were very lengthy, and so they were just very quick hitters, but they got the point across that I think they were trying to get across. So to me, I didn't see an issue with it. Again, movies are subjective. If you did, that's totally fine. But I like their involvement in the movie. It made sense to me. I see where they're going with it, or at least where I think they're going. Let's talk about some of the best performances in this entire film. Like I said at the beginning, the one thing about this movie is that it does have some of the best acting performances known to the MCU, period. And those performances can't be mentioned without mentioning Shuri, Letitia Wright as Shuri. Just absolutely incredible. Such an emotional and powerful performance. I didn't necessarily expect to go into this film and just be completely captivated by Letitia Wright as Shuri. I knew she was going to be the main character, but nothing she really did in the first couple movies captivated me and truly grabbed me. I didn't dislike her character in any other film she was in. She just didn't really draw, she didn't command my attention every single time she was on the screen, if that makes sense. But in this movie, that was the case. She crushed it. And let's be 100% real. This was no easy task to suddenly be thrust into the role of main character and called upon to help carry a movie that was never meant to be hers to begin with, right? And to do that while also wrestling with real grief and trauma of losing a guy that she calls her big brother in real life, Chadwick Boseman. All of that just makes what she did an even more monumental achievement. She killed it, and she deserves all her flowers. You can say what you will about her as an actress. I know some people disagree with her stances and viewpoints and the way that she goes about certain things or says certain things, but all that aside, as an actress, her performance was incredible, and she deserves all the recognition, and she honestly deserves an Oscar nomination. And I don't think she'll get it because comic book movies notoriously get the shaft when it comes to Oscar nominations, and sometimes people are overhyping performances in comic book movies and talking about Oscar nominations when they're not actually deserved. In this case, I do think it is. In this case, I think there are multiple actresses and actors in this film who deserve Oscar nominations. Will they get it? Again, if I were a betting man, I'd say no, but it's definitely deserved. I loved Shuri's arc throughout this entire movie. I thought it was so good that her arc was so similar to T'Challa's arc in Civil War. The first time that we see T'Challa as the Black Panther in Captain America Civil War, the arc is almost identical when you think about it. In Civil War, T'Challa's father was killed, which leads him to seek revenge. He's just angry and bitter throughout the entire movie. And he finally comes to the realization that the vengeance has consumed him and it's doing him more harm than good. And he's seeing how it consumes everybody else and that it's also doing everyone else more harm than good. And for Shuri, the exact same arc, which was such a neat parallel to me, such a brilliant parallel. Shuri's mother was killed right in front of her, just like, I believe it's right in front of her. Shuri was in that room. I think I'm pretty sure. I'd have to see it again, but I believe Shuri was in the room when she watched her mother drown. Essentially, Shuri's mother was killed. She gets insanely bitter and angry, and you can't really blame her. And then ultimately realizes that her vengeance is doing more harm than good. It's not really going to change the fact that her mother has passed, and it's just going to only fuel the fire to her bitterness and her vengeance. And she ends up overcoming that. Just a beautiful arc, and there's so much that goes into it throughout the course of the movie, and I thought it was so brilliantly written and well done, and I loved it. The other performance that was just out of this world, and this, like, if I had to nominate one actor or actress from this film for an Oscar and award an Oscar to somebody, if I had that kind of power, which I wish I did, it's probably good that I don't, but if I did, it would be Angela Bassett as Queen Ramonda. Unbelievable. You want to talk about a powerful, gut-wrenching, emotional performance. This is it. This is not a performance that you see in comic book movies very often. Very, very, very seldomly do you see a performance from an actor or actress in a comic book movie that just grips you with emotion. And Angela Bassett delivered on every single level. And I will be upset if she doesn't at least get nominated. She may not win, and honestly, if she doesn't win, that's okay. I feel like she deserves to win. Because if you could pull that kind of emotion out of people in a comic book movie and deliver that kind of performance in a genre where those performances aren't really known and don't happen that frequently, I feel like you deserve that Oscar. But maybe I'm being biased, and I probably am, and that's okay. But I feel like a nomination is at least deserved. So, incredible. Like I said before, I didn't think she would die. I was shocked, but it did add to the weight of the movie, and it honestly fits so well within the story. It saddens me because I love her character, and it's a bummer that we're not going to get to see her. I'm sure we will to an extent with the ancestral plane and flashbacks, things like that. But obviously, as a character, she's gone, and it's a tough pill to swallow, but I think it was the right call. Almost done here. Just a couple more things, but I want to talk about Killmonger for a second because, oh boy. For those of you guys that know me, Killmonger is one of my favorite MCU villains of all time. He's number 2 for me. Thanos is probably number 1. But Killmonger has always been number 2. I just love his character arc. I think he's a sympathetic villain as well. I talked about him last week. I'm not going to go into all that. But I just got to say, I called it. If you listened to the podcast last week, I said that I felt like that I hoped we were going to see Killmonger in this movie. And I felt like if we did see him, it would be in the capacity of Shuri somehow encountering him in the ancestral plane if she ends up taking in a heart-shaped herb or something like that. And maybe she's going to encounter him and seek advice from him on how to become the Black Panther or win against Helicon or something like that. And like that is exactly what happened to the T. I can't believe I actually called it. I don't typically get those types of things right too often. And so in the theater, I was so bummed because the people that I saw the movie with, I didn't actually like share that theory with them. And so I didn't get to brag about it in that moment. I was the only one. I'm just sitting there like, man, I can't believe I got this right. I was so hype when Shuri turned the corner around that throne and the room in the ancestral plane. And you see Killmonger sitting there in the all white. Oh my gosh. So good. Such a great inclusion. And it wasn't something that felt like fan service. It fit so perfectly within the narrative of the movie. I love that he still had the same exact cockiness. I kind of wondered, like, okay, if we see Killmonger, what's he going to be? Is it going to be a reformed Killmonger? Is he going to be remorseful and, admitting that, okay, you know what? Maybe I did some things wrong. Maybe I went a little bit too far. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. It wasn't that at all. Like, this dude was still 100% like, I was right. You guys were wrong. Look at what's happening now. Wakanda wouldn't be where it is if it wasn't for me. And honestly, he's not really wrong about that. He was ultimately maybe the biggest reason why Wakanda changed for the better. And he knows it. And he has no problem admitting that. Obviously, he does still have that element of vengeance and rage in him, which he passes on to Shuri. And I love that. I feel like that was so perfectly well done. And I've seen some people say that they didn't love that because they don't feel like Shuri they don't feel like that fits Shuri's character, that they feel like Shuri is too smart of a person to succumb to what Killmonger was saying and what Killmonger was trying to get her to do. And I just don't believe that that's correct. Not saying that Shuri isn't a smart character, but I think if you are experiencing grief to the level that she's experienced it, anything goes, right? Like anything is game at that point. She has experienced the loss of her brother just recently, and that was tragic. And she puts that on herself, right? She puts that on herself because she wasn't able to replicate the heart-shaped herb, and it isn't actually her fault, but she takes the blame. And then on top of that, as you're still mourning that and figuring out that, and you're starting to get into this war with this other nation that you, up until like a week ago, didn't realize existed, now you lose your mom to that very nation. And I don't know. I think when we say things like, oh, well, Shuri's character wouldn't actually participate in that type of vengeance or rage or revenge, I just think that's insensitive to what grief and mourning can actually do to a person. Because if you've ever been in a season of grieving and mourning and depression, you know that you can become a completely different person. Like it changes you 1,000%. It changes you, and anything goes in that season. And in terms of what you could be thinking, what could happen to you. And so I feel like it makes perfect sense that that's what Shuri would turn to, because it's something that she was able to control. And again, I just feel like it's so, like the whole movie is so brilliantly written. I am so glad that Killmonger was included in this film. I thought his inclusion was fantastic. I wish we got more. I know we didn't need more. It wasn't his movie. His time is come and gone. But I really hope that in some way, shape, or form, we get to see Killmonger again in the MCU, because we know that coming back from the afterlife in the MCU is not out of the question. We've now seen it in Moon Knight. Nothing's out of the question. I really hope Killmonger somehow finds his way back. Okay, finishing up here, we have to talk about that mid-credit scene, because, wow, easily one of the best, if not the best, mid-credit scenes in the entire MCU. It was so good. And again, Zeke called it. I like this, dude. You need to buy a lottery ticket, dude, because you're like out here predicting the future. Last week in this podcast, Zeke sat here and he talked about how we were debating on whether or not they should recast T'Challa. And I said that I was in favor of the recasting. And Zeke said he thought that the way it would happen was that that would be weird, that Nakia and T'Challa had a secret son somewhere that we just didn't know about, and that the Black Panther mantle was going to get passed on to him. Now, he didn't say that he thought the kid was going to be named T'Challa. That was something that neither of us saw coming. But he was right in the fact that they do have a son, and his name is Toussaint in Haitian, but that translates to T'Challa in Wakandan, which was just so perfect. And when they revealed that that's what his name was, I about lost it. Because ultimately, there's been all this talk about will they or won't they recast T'Challa? Should they or shouldn't they? And it's going to happen. And it's going to happen in a way that I don't think anybody can be upset with. The people who want T'Challa recasted, you're going to get it. Like you're going to see another T'Challa in the MCU as the Black Panther. It's going to happen. We know it's going to happen now. And for the people who didn't want T'Challa recast, you also get your way, because the actual character of T'Challa that passes in this movie isn't being recast, but we are getting another T'Challa. It's just a different one, but it fits so well. Like, it's so well written into the storyline of the MCU that I don't understand how you can dislike it. I'm so excited about that. I'm curious to see the timeline and how that's going to go, because obviously they can't jump super far into the future, because you have other actors that are going to be playing the same characters. Obviously, you're not going to have the same kid that was playing T'Challa in this movie play T'Challa down the road, because you're going to need him to grow up a lot faster than he's actually going to grow up. But you can't all of a sudden have this kid jump from being, I don't know how old he is in the movie. He looks like he's probably like, 8 or so, 6. Maybe they said he was 6. I can't remember. But you're not going to have this kid all of a sudden be 18 the next time we see him. It's just not possible. So I do wonder how long it's going to be before we see T'Challa. I wonder if T'Challa might be a member of the Young Avengers in some way, because obviously we know the MCU is setting up for that. I don't know. I'm just very curious. Little fun Easter egg, though. The end credit scene, or the mid credit scene, wasn't actually the first time that we saw young Toussaint or T'Challa in that movie, because when Queen Ramonda visits the children's home where Nakia is working at, somewhere like first half of the movie, one of the first kids that runs up to Queen Ramonda to show her where Nakia is working at is T'Challa. But we don't recognize, like, we don't know who he is. To us, he's just some random kid at that point. And when you go back and see it, you realize, oh my gosh, he was there the entire time. And in his mind, he's just like, hey, grandma, let me come show you where mom's at today. So good. I am so excited for what's to come with that and what they're going to do. The only other question that I have is what's next for Wakanda, because obviously there were some things that were left open-ended. Biggest question to me is who rules Wakanda at this point? And I feel like the movie answered that, or at least alluded to it. To me, it seems like it's definitely going to be M'Baku. I am 100% for that. I wanted to see him kind of take that leadership role anyway, and so I'm really excited to see where he goes with that. It feels to me like they definitely set up for Shuri to be stepping away and for M'Baku to be stepping in, and we know, and it fits the narrative so well, because that's something that M'Baku has wanted since the first movie. Obviously, he wasn't ready for it in the first movie, because for him in the first movie, it was also going to be vengeance. It was going to be a Killmonger type thing where he just wanted it because he felt like he had been wronged by Wakanda. And his heart wasn't going to be in the right place if he had gotten that seat of leadership. Whereas now he's actually ready for it. He is a part of the nation. Wakanda has embraced him the way that it should have in the first place, but never did. And T'Challa thankfully changed that. But now he's in a place where his heart is ready to lead that nation. I think they're ready for him to lead. They've seen him lead in other capacities now and seen that he can be trustworthy. And so I'm excited to see what happens with him. I think we're going to get to see that in the Wakanda series. I don't know what that series is going to entail. All I know is that I'm in love with the world of Wakanda, and they could do an entire series of movies about just the world of Wakanda, and I would be all for it. If you did 10 movies about different aspects of Wakanda, the Black Panther and the Dora Milaje and all these other, and just daily life in Wakanda, I'm here for it. I'm so enamored with that world. They do such a good job. Ryan Coogler has done such a phenomenal job of building that world, and it is the best built world in all of the MCU, and I cannot wait for whatever the Wakanda series has for us. I would assume we're going to see the fallout of what's happened in the rebuilding of the nation of Wakanda after the death of T'Challa and after the attack from Talokan, and now they're figuring out a new leader, which I'm assuming will be M'Baku. The other question is Shuri stepping away from being the Black Panther? I think that she is. In the comics, she's not a full-time Black Panther. She is a Black Panther for a time. She's not 100% of the time. I feel like she's going to step away. Part of me thinks that we're going to see M'Baku be Black Panther. I think we might see a few different people wear the hat of Black Panther for a while, especially now that I think they officially have figured out how to regrow the heart-shaped herb. And so I think they're going to be back into that rhythm of always having those available for the next Black Panther, whoever it is that steps into that role. But I think we'll see a number of different people assume that role, or maybe it'll just be M'Baku, and it'll be M'Baku until T'Challa grows up and it becomes a Lion King scenario where T'Challa has to challenge M'Baku for the throne, and maybe M'Baku at that point will be so in love with ruling Wakanda that he's not going to want to step away, and he's going to have to be fought for it. Maybe that's not going to be the case, but either way, really excited to see what comes next for the nation of Wakanda. But that's it. That is the review, the breakdown, and my reaction of Black Panther Wakanda Forever. Like I said, I love this movie. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on the movie. Comment, if you're watching us on YouTube, comment down below. Let me know what you thought. Let me know where you rank it in the MCU, what you would rate it out of 10. However it is that you want to evaluate the movie, just let me know. Let's dialogue about it. I would love to hear your thoughts, what you loved, what you didn't like so much, if anything. And what you're looking forward to next with Wakanda and with the MCU. I'm excited to see this a second time so I can truly give a real evaluation of where I feel like it fits in the MCU. I definitely think it's a top 10 for me, but I need to see it again to really make a judgment. I don't know where I like it in terms of whether or not I feel like it's better than the first Black Panther. Like I said, the first Black Panther is a top 5 MCU movie, so that's lofty. That's lofty for this to be ranked above that, but I'm not saying that it's out of the realm of possibility. I always like movies better the second time I see them, so I'm excited to see what I catch and how much I fall in love with the movie even more when I end up seeing it again. So make sure you comment, let me know, let's talk about this movie. If you're just listening on any other podcast platform, please send us an email, midwestmarvelguy@gmail.com. Please send an email about what you thought about the movie, some of the give me some dialogue about some of the stuff that we talked about in this podcast today, and we will read it in our next podcast. I would love to interact with you guys in that way. Make sure you guys like and review. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and follow on social media platforms, especially TikTok and YouTube. Those are the big ones that we're really building up right now. And yeah, I'm excited for what's ahead, and I can't wait to talk to you guys next time. Until next week's episode, peace out, nerds.